Who is your favorite guitarist of all time?
Jimi Hendrix. I think, it's got to be Jimmy. Great guy.
Pretty good pals, weren't you?
Yeah, well, I knew him a little bit because he kind of got discovered over here, really, even though he'd been working a long time.
Okay, let's be real for a second. When you think of Paul McCartney, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Probably that iconic Hufner bass, right? Or maybe yesterday playing softly in the background while your dad rants about how music just isn't the same anymore. But here's the twist. Before Sir Paul was shaping pop history and stealing hearts on The Ed Sullivan Show, he was just a wide-eyed kid in Liverpool, totally obsessed with guitars. Yep, before he was a Beatle, Paul was a full-on guitar nerd, standing front row at smoky clubs, staring at fingers flying over fretboards like they held the secrets of the universe. That obsession? It wasn't casual. McCartney reportedly once told Rolling Stone that he'd study guitar players so intensely. It was like watching hawks in their natural habitat, predatory precision included. He wasn't just listening to notes, he was decoding them, like a musical detective in a leather jacket. And this is where the tea gets piping hot. Because in this video, we're not just name-dropping a few famous axe slingers. No. We're pulling back the velvet curtain to reveal the 6 guitarists who literally shaped the McCartney we know today. The unsung heroes behind those legendary Beatles riffs and Wings hooks. Buckle up, because these aren't just influences. They're the backstage puppeteers of rock royalty. Buddy Holly, the ghost, in Paul McCartney's guitar strings. All right, let's spill some vintage rock and roll tea, shall we? Before Paul McCartney became Sir Paul, before the screaming fans and Abbey Road photo ops, there was one bespectacled rock pioneer who basically owned a permanent lease in young Paul's heart, Buddy Holly. That's right. Paul wasn't just a casual fan. He was a full-blown Buddy Holly superfan, borderline obsessed in the cutest, most musically productive way possible. While other kids were playing football, Paul was in his room, strumming a guitar and asking himself, what would Buddy do? This wasn't just musical admiration. It was a full-on mentorship from beyond the grave. According to insiders, Paul could play every Buddy Holly song ever recorded. And he didn't just play them, he channeled them. John Lennon even joked that it was like Paul was possessed by Holly's ghost. Spooky? Maybe. But impressive? Absolutely. Things took a wild turn when Paul bought Buddy Holly's publishing catalog in the 1970s. Not as an investment, mind you. Paul called it a family heirloom. And when Buddy's widow reportedly called him out for profiting off Holly's legacy, Paul didn't deny it. He owned it. I've spent my life trying to live up to what he started. Now that's rock and roll royalty with a soul. Paul McCartney's secret love affair with Chet Atkins. Okay, let's take a moment to appreciate one of the most unexpected musical plot twists of all time. While everyone else was busy associating Paul McCartney with British invasion cool and Beatles mop-top swagger, he was secretly geeking out over a country guitar legend with a thumb pick and a clean-cut suit, Chet Atkins. Yes, you heard that right. Country music's most polished picker had Sir Paul wrapped around his fretboard long before anyone suspected. Paul didn't stumble onto Chet Atkins through the usual Beatles route. He actually discovered him in his dad's record collection, buried between jazz standards and old swing tunes. And while John and George were riffing on blues licks, Paul was in his room whispering, "How the heck does he do that?" Chet's finger-picking was like a 6-string symphony, delicate, disciplined, and borderline magical. Paul didn't just admire it, he studied it. Fast forward to the recording of Blackbird, and suddenly it all makes sense. Paul showed up to the studio with a stack of Chet's records, reportedly telling George Martin he wanted that same silky precision. And get this, when the two finally met in Nashville in the 1970s, they jammed until the early hours, trading tricks like old friends. Paul shared melodic ideas. Chet taught him the finger and thumb technique. Honestly, if that session had been recorded, it'd be worth more than Abbey Road on vinyl. Chapter 3. Chuck Berry. Let's talk about Chuck Berry, aka the man who basically invented the guitar moves and the swagger Paul McCartney would later fine-tune for global domination. Before the Beatles became, well, the Beatles, Paul was already knee-deep in Chuck Berry's riffs, treating his records like ancient scrolls filled with guitar gospel. And honestly, if Buddy Holly was Paul's spirit animal, Chuck Berry was his unofficial professor of rhythm and attitude. What's wild is how deep that influence went. Paul wasn't just playing along with Chuck's songs, he was deconstructing them like a mad scientist in a music lab. According to people who were there, he'd spend hours translating Berry's double stops and fiery solos into melodic bass lines, effectively transforming Chuck's guitar language into something brand new. The result? That signature McCartney bass groove that sounds like it's dancing across the track. But hold up, it wasn't all warm hugs and mutual admiration. When the Beatles hit America in the early 1960s, they asked to meet Chuck Berry, and he totally brushed them off, called them copycats. Ouch. Fast forward a few decades, and they finally crossed paths again. Chuck leaned in and whispered, "You did all right with what you stole from me, boy." And Paul, cool as ever, fired back. "We didn't steal it, we transformed it." Rock royalty drama at its finest. Chapter 4. Jimi Hendrix, the guitar god who blew McCartney's mind. All right, if rock history had a mic drop moment, this would be it. Picture London, 1967. The Beatles had just released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And 3 days later, yes, 3, Jimi Hendrix took the stage and shredded the title track live in front of a stunned Paul McCartney. That night changed everything. Paul wasn't just impressed, he was floored, like someone had plugged his brain into a cosmic amplifier and turned it up to 11. Let's not forget, this was before everyone had Jimi posters on their walls. Back then, Hendrix was still new to the scene, raw and fearless, lighting guitars on fire and basically rewriting what it meant to be a guitarist. Paul wasn't just a fan, he was shook. He reportedly told the studio crew the next day, "Everything we've done is obsolete." Imagine the humility it takes to say that, when you're Paul freaking McCartney. But here's where it gets juicy. Paul and Jimi almost recorded together. They had a session booked in 1970, with songs tailored to Jimi's style. But before it could happen, tragedy struck. Hendrix passed away, and Paul was devastated. We're talking sliding down a wall levels of grief. That unrealized collaboration still haunts rock fans to this day, like the greatest jam session that never was. George Harrison, the quiet guitar genius who silently shaped McCartney.
A whole lot of spending money, it's gonna take plenty of money.
Okay, so let's talk about one of the most deliciously complicated relationships in Beatles history. No, we're not talking about Paul and John. We're talking about Paul McCartney and George Harrison, two bandmates, two musical masterminds, and two guys who could go from harmony to heated standoff in the time it takes to strum a G chord. On the surface, Paul rarely listed George as a major guitar influence. But behind the scenes? Oh, honey, Paul was watching everything George did. According to insiders, McCartney secretly envied George's guitar evolution, especially his mastery of slide guitar. You know, That smooth, soulful wail that became George's signature in his solo career? Well, during the Beatles' Abbey Road sessions, Paul allegedly dismissed it as Indian nonsense. Harsh? Absolutely. But later, Ringo spilled that after those arguments, you could find Paul alone in the studio, trying to recreate George's solos. Caught red-handed, Paul. The ultimate turning point came years later, after George's passing, when Paul finally admitted the truth. George's genius was in knowing when not to play. That kind of restraint made everyone else sound like they were trying too hard. So yeah, George might have been the quiet Beatle, but his guitar spoke volumes. And Paul? He was definitely listening. Scotty Moore, the rockabilly pioneer who left Paul McCartney speechless. Let's rewind the tape. Long before Beatlemania, long before the Shea Stadium screams and psychedelic album covers, there was a teenage Paul McCartney in Liverpool, wide-eyed and completely floored by one legendary guitarist who came straight out of Elvis Presley's entourage. That man? Scotty Moore. The name might not get tossed around in today's mainstream guitar convos, but for Paul, Scotty was the guy who cracked the code on how to make a guitar truly talk. Back in 1956, when Moore's rockabilly leads were lighting up jukeboxes, Paul had what he described as an out-of-body experience. He couldn't believe someone could blend country twang with blues swagger so flawlessly. Paul would stay up all night trying to mimic Scotty's licks. We're talking obsessive levels of admiration. Even Pete Best, the Beatles' original drummer, spilled the tea. Paul was chasing that echo-drenched rockabilly sound like it held the keys to the universe. When Paul and Scotty finally met in Nashville in the 1970s, the vibes were tense. Scotty felt overshadowed by Beatlemania, but Paul wasn't there to flex. He dropped to one knee, literally, and said, "Without you, none of us would be here." Iconic, emotional, legendary. Scotty's thumb-pick precision would echo through Paul's work for decades, quietly shaping the DNA of pop and rock history. Final chord. How 6 guitar legends tuned the strings of Paul McCartney's genius. So, what happens when a bass-playing Beatle with a gift for melody spends his life quietly studying the world's greatest guitarists? You get a musical chameleon who could write ballads that broke hearts, riffs that launched revolutions, and solos that made stadiums erupt. Paul McCartney didn't just absorb these influences, he internalized them, stitched them into the fabric of his sound, and somehow made them all feel uniquely his own. Each guitarist, whether it was Buddy Holly's pop-perfect rhythms, Chet Atkins's meticulous fingerstyle, or George Harrison's understated slide magic, left an indelible fingerprint on Paul's creative DNA. Some of them he praised publicly. Others, like George, were the subject of silent admiration and, occasionally, a bit of tension. And then there were figures like Chuck Berry and Scotty Moore, whose styles Paul didn't just admire, he practically reverse-engineered. It wasn't mimicry, it was evolution. And let's not forget the mind-blowing moment when Jimi Hendrix made Paul feel like everything he'd done was suddenly outdated. That level of humility and drive, that's what kept Paul pushing boundaries for over 6 decades. So, next time you hum a Beatles tune or tap along to a Wings groove, just know you're hearing not just one man's genius, but the echo of 6 guitar gods playing along.